Let's go. Let's go.
The US and China are on a collision course in the Pacific.
I don't believe that the American people understand what it means for the United States to defend Taiwan if China were to attack. The stakes are very high.
Both countries are engaged in a massive military buildup in the region.
It is our responsibility to not only defend American interests, but to defend the interests of our allies and partners throughout this region as well. Don't pick a fight with us today, because we're going to win.
But as the US military expands, so do the burdens and threats of hosting American bases.
There are so many ways that we're being erased in our own homeland every single day.
Who gets killed first if there should be a war? We are a sacrificial lamb.
And those who live next to them are pushing back.
Okinawa wo senjou ni sasenai zo.
This is occupied indigenous land! Shame on you!
One wounded.
Gunshot wound, left knee.
Left navel?
Left knee. We're gonna get him on a stretcher. We're gonna start moving him out.
This might look like combat, but it's actually training for a very old school type of war.
All right, good to go.
It's downhill. Hit the river. We should be good. It's gonna be a slosh.
We're here in Hawaii, where the U.S. Army is training troops in jungle combat. These are skills that the military says are critical to counter China in the Pacific.
This is jungle school, where soldiers learn how to fight and survive in the tropics. Battlefields that are more like Vietnam than Iraq or Afghanistan.
This is where we build warfighting readiness for America's Pacific Division. The 25th Infantry Division was founded back in 1941, about 2 months right before the Japanese flew over this island and attacked Pearl Harbor. So as we went through World War II, we were fighting through the jungles. Then in the Korean War in the 50s, same kind of thing. A lot of heavy foliage, a lot of tough terrain. We realized we need to train our soldiers to be ready to fight in the jungle.
What's the hardest part of fighting in the jungle?
Terrain.
Ropes.
Steep hillsides down into rivers, canals, and then coming back out of those, there's tight vegetation, so really you can kind of only move single file versus having a platoon spread out across vast distances, trying to navigate your way through a jungle. It's not like you can look into the distance and say, I want to walk to that point. You have to understand, looking at a map, how are you going to get to that point when you can only see about 20 meters in front of your face?
The military balance of power has shifted dramatically over the last 20 years. Before, the United States was the most predominant military power in the Asia-Pacific region. That is no longer the case. China has been building up its military capabilities since the end of the Cold War, and this is what is alarming to the U.S. military.
Is the U.S. military preparing for a conflict with China?
Yes, I think that's the number one priority. They're worried that there will be a conflict over Taiwan.
China sees Taiwan as part of its territory, and President Xi Jinping has repeatedly said that, quote, reunification is inevitable. The U.S. has long had a policy of strategic ambiguity over Taiwan, not fully committing to defending the island against a Chinese invasion, but also not ruling it out. But as China ramps up military and economic pressure in the Pacific, the U.S. military is responding.
Hey, team, let's go. Let's go.
Across the region, America is expanding its presence, beefing up weapon systems, gaining more access in allied countries, and distributing American forces more broadly, all in an effort to checkmate China.
Are you training more soldiers here now than you have in previous years?
We are. We continue to ramp up the training here at the Lightning Academy. Train about 2,500 soldiers out of the academy each year, and we know there are various pacing threats in this region. It is our responsibility to not only defend American interests, but to defend the interests of our allies and partners throughout this region as well. Don't pick a fight with us today, because we're going to win.
Given the U.S. strategic interests in maintaining forward deployed forces in the Asia-Pacific region, the burden of hosting those forces falls on the local people. I don't believe that the American people understand what it means for the United States to defend Taiwan if China were to attack. This would be the first time that the United States would be engaged in a direct military conflict with a nuclear power. And so the stakes are very high, and the potential cost in life would be enormous.
One of the most important locations for U.S. deterrence against China is here. Japan hosts 54,000 U.S. military personnel, and most of them are on the southern island of Okinawa. Japan adopted a pacifist constitution after World War II, and since then has relied on the US for defense. But for decades, many Okinawans have protested the American presence.
This is an annual march against the U.S. military presence here in Okinawa, Japan. It's being held on the anniversary of the U.S. returning Okinawa to Japan in 1972.
The anti-base movement reached a critical mass in 1995 after 3 American service members were convicted in the abduction and rape of a 12-year-old Japanese girl. Tens of thousands took to the streets, and U.S.-Japan relations were thrown into crisis. As a result, the U.S. agreed to close the controversial Futenma Marine Corps base and move thousands of Marines off of Okinawa. But 30 years later, the base is still active, and Okinawans continue to protest after fatal crashes of the military's Osprey helicopters, environmental contamination, and more high-profile cases of sexual violence.
沖縄から基地をなくし、日本から基地をなくし、声を上げて平和な日本を作っていきましょう。共に頑張りましょ
う。私たちが住む町のど真ん中に、そういう軍事基地があるわけです。日常的にヘリの墜落とか、そういう状態はアメリカでは認められない状況じゃないかなと私は思っています。
What's your main issue with the U.S. military presence here?
敵対する国が現れた時にやっぱり真っ先に狙われるのは、軍事施設だというふうに思っています。すぐ狙われる標的になるところになるので、
平和な日本を作ろう。
Nearly 3 decades after the pivotal 1995 protests, a key part of the US-Japan agreement is finally being implemented. Starting in 2024, 9,000 Marines are set to leave Okinawa. But the burden of hosting these forces isn't disappearing, it's shifting onto another island.
We're on the USS Ronald Reagan. It's here in Guam for a massive military exercise called Valiant Shield, which is one of the ways the US tries to assert its presence here in the Pacific. They call it projecting power, and Guam is essential to those plans.
1,400 miles southeast of Okinawa lies Guam, a US territory. Guam first came under US control in 1898 after the Spanish-American War. During World War II, the indigenous Chamorro population suffered a brutal occupation by Japan. The island was recaptured by American forces in 1944, and the end of that military campaign is celebrated as Liberation Day.
Today we celebrate 80 years of liberation.
Since then, Guam's location has made it hugely valuable to the US military, which refers to it as the tip of the spear. Along with tourism, the military is a main driver of the economy. In 2022, 41% of Guam's GDP came from defense spending, the highest of any US state or territory. And because Guam is US soil, the Department of Defense can build and expand here without the kind of local agreements they would need in a sovereign nation.
Why are the Marines moving from Okinawa to Guam?
The Marines are moving to Marine Corps Base Camp Laws as part of an agreement between the US government and the Japanese government to move Marines out of Okinawa, Japan. So moving the Marines here to Guam still provides a strategic logistics location for the Marine Corps to be able to project power out.
Camp Laws is the first base the Marines have built since 1952. It's costing $8 billion to construct, and that's not all coming from the US government. Across the base, there are these signs showing the nearly $3 billion that Japan is providing as part of the bilateral agreement.
There have been decades of protest against the military and the Marines in particular in Okinawa, and that led to the negotiations to move the Marines to Guam. Why should the people of Guam not be worried that those same issues that the Marines had in Okinawa won't follow them here to Guam?
I think when we're looking at this dynamic that we have to look internal at the Marines here. We talked to the Marines about our reputation as a Marine Corps here on the island. Our reputation on the island is very good. We actually work very closely with our community. We have to continue to do the right thing and be those good community members that the people here on Guam expect from us.
So is this like a fresh start for the Marines in a new location?
I don't think it's a fresh start. We have a continuous history here on Guam. We're going to continue to be the professional warfighters that we are.
You are entering stolen land. Valid shield pollutes our air, pollutes our water. Our people are dying of diseases. Shame on you! This is occupied indigenous land. We must demilitarize and deoccupy.
Nate Flores is a community organizer opposed to the U.S. military presence in Guam. One of the most contentious aspects of the Marines' relocation is the danger zone created by the base firing range. The range was built on a ridge directly above this point, called Latexan, a sacred site in Guam's indigenous Chamorro culture that's part of a national wildlife refuge.
This is a place where we come to connect with our ancestors in a very direct, real way. We feel their presence here very strongly. And so there is a pictograph here. These are definitely over 1,000 years old.
Wow. This is incredible.
Yeah. It's kind of hard to believe that all of that destruction and desecration is just right over us while this is here. And this will be, inaccessible for most of the year to our community.
So we are at the Live Fire Training Range Complex at Marine Corps Base Camp Laws, and this is our pistol range.
So when this is in effect, that's when there's a danger zone
Yes.
for the local community and they can't come near here.
Yes, exactly. So when this range is hot or any of our ranges are hot, we set up a buffer area in the event that a round escapes the range.
The Marines estimate that this danger zone could be in effect up to 273 days a year, and during that time, no one will be allowed to visit Latexan.
What's happening up there is a violence to the land and to this place. And, it shows the real disconnect. The military assumes that all of that destruction is going to be isolated to that one area, but it's connected to this landscape, the harm is so far-reaching.
Guam is a small island, and nearly a third of its land is used by the Department of Defense. The military's presence affects everything from immigration to the local housing market, with many locals finding themselves priced out. And with the buildup of military facilities and personnel, those pressures are only going to increase. But despite all this, the military does enjoy broad public support on the island.
How many people have you recruited to the Navy here?
About 175 in the nation right now. I'm going to say I'm top 10.
You're a top 10 recruiter for the Navy in the U.S.?
Yes. The Navy sells itself.
It's also a huge source of employment and upward mobility. Guam has one of the highest recruitment rates in the United States.
Welcome to Antonio's or Isabella's Cocoa Resort.
This is your resort?
Yeah, this used to be called Cocoa Pump. Let me see if I could find a brochure of the Cocoa Pump.
Antonio Sablan owns land just below Camp Blas. The Department of Defense limits how much he can develop his prime waterfront property, which he turned into a day-use resort for tourists. But business collapsed during the pandemic. And in 2023, a typhoon destroyed much of the property.
We have a firing range up on top of the hill.
Just up there?
Yeah. What do you think is going to happen when they start going the boom, bang, bang, bang? Would you be a tourist that would enjoy this place down here when all you hear is gunfire?
What do you think of the Marines coming to Guam because they have to leave Japan?
So why are they leaving Okinawa? Because they're getting kicked out of Okinawa. So what are we going to do in Guam? Open our arms and say, oh, you are our American soldiers? The hell with that. Why are they coming to Guam? Because we don't have any right. We don't have any say-so. We cannot say no. They determine, they decide, and they execute. We're the ones who's going to be, suffering the brunt of the U.S. military.
On top of the Marine Corps firing range, now the Department of Defense is planning to conduct tests of a new missile defense system for Guam. No one will be allowed in the area when the tests are being conducted. And Antonio's land is right in the proposed restricted area.
Well, now they're saying that we got to stay away from our land because we're endangered.
You're in danger on your own land?
Yeah.
Why?
Because of, whatever. Misfired rockets or what is coming in and might just veer off and land in our property. They said it's for safety reason, but safety on whose behalf? You endanger me, you're firing gun into my property, and you're saying, hey, stay away from your property.
The U.S. military's presence on Guam also makes it a likely target, according to experts. The Center for Strategic and International Studies, a prominent D.C. think tank, runs war games of a U.S.-China conflict over Taiwan. And in every scenario, China strikes Guam.
The military says this missile defense program is to protect the island of Guam.
Protect them, not us. We're nobody's enemy. Who gets killed first if there should be a war? Absolutely our people, the island of Guam. The question is, when do I die? When do I get powderized by the nuclear warheads of the adversaries of the United States?
In many ways, the military's critics on Guam have their hands tied. And that's because of the island's status as a territory.
And half a day, welcome back to Challenge the Status Quo. My name is Melvin Wampat Borja. At a fundamental level, the conflict really exists between us and our colonizer, us and our administering power, the United States federal government.
I don't think that we have to accept a role that is carved out for us. We need to devise a new reality for the people of Guam.
Melvin Wampat Borja is the head of Guam's official Commission on Decolonization. It's a government office that's tasked with educating the people of Guam about ways the territory could get self-governance, and, eventually, holding a referendum on Guam's future.
The unincorporated territory is just a palatable way for the United States to be able to call us what we are without having to say colony.
And what does this status mean practically for Guam?
Practically, it means that we will only ever deal with the military on a consultative level. We don't negotiate with the military. We're informed by the military, and in best case scenario, we mitigate, which is very different than, say, Japan.
The Commission is pushing 3 options for Guam: becoming a U.S. state, becoming fully independent, or having what's called a free association agreement, where the U.S. is Guam's exclusive military partner, like in Palau or the Marshall Islands. But it's almost impossible to imagine that the U.S. would recognize the outcome of such a vote. What do most people in Guam want its political status to be?
I don't know. We've never been asked. All of those options are absolutely viable, but they're only viable if remaining a territory is off the table. Why would they honor any of those statuses when they could have it all right now? They don't have to ask permission around here at all. They do whatever they want.
The attitude of the U.S. government is basically this is necessary for U.S. strategic interests, and the local community need to basically accept that. In the end, the local communities have very little choice but to accept the U.S. military presence.
This island is my homeland. We're the farthest U.S. base, and we are a sacrificial land.
America's been in how many wars since World War II? And when's the last time that those wars hit the homeland? Those wars are often fought in other places, and it's those places that bear the burden. You know, we're not gonna stop 2 nations from having a conflict, but we should at the very least be in the driver's seat of our own destiny.